Then There's California. That's our podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Providing comprehensive health care coverage to undocumented immigrants has long been a fringe dream. Those attitudes and policies blocking access to health care for undocumented immigrants are changing, thanks to the growing influence and voting power of those who represent immigrant populations, their longtime grassroots advocates, and even those who have themselves come of age in those immigrant communities, who are winning elected office and influence in the halls of power. Well, on this edition of Then There's California, we'll discuss the evolving process of advocating for health care coverage for undocumented Californians. State Senator Maria Elena Durazo represents the 24th Senate District of Los Angeles, whose many communities personify the California immigrant experience and journey. Senator Durazo's farm worker family roots and legacy as a labor and union organizer and leader have been the template for the work that she's doing as a freshman legislator elected in 2018, though, as we've said before, hardly a freshman when it comes to her impact and success in advocating for policies for immigrant and low-income communities, not only in Southern California, but across the state. And also joining us is Ronald Coleman, Director of Policy and Legislative Advocacy for Health Access California, the statewide health care consumer advocacy coalition, a voice for quality, affordable health care for all Californians. Senator, Mr. Coleman, welcome to Then There's California.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Senator, we have talked on this podcast before. We did a wonderful conversation earlier in the year with you and Dolores Huerta. We've talked about your family's journey and your experience as migrant farm workers up and down California's coast. But it's significant to note how that experience and your years as a nationally known labor leader, not just here in California, but across the country, they've been so much a foundation for your official policy positions as a lawmaker. Everything from fighting to ban toxic pesticides to fighting for health care for our immigrant population. So you sort of hit the ground running. Does it feel like it's just been really an extension already of the work that you had done before taking office?
Yes, and actually, I found that great success when I was in the labor movement, not only in Los Angeles, but as you said, across the state. My experience in the movement was you work someplace, everybody in that workplace has access to the same rights, the same responsibilities, and the same benefits. So I grew up in my career where all meant all. It wasn't a workplace where some were covered and some had benefits and some got a wage increase. It was all, period. And so when we negotiated with employers and businesses, it was everybody. And it's a challenge to think of California as being split up into those who can, somehow those who are worthier, somehow those who we can afford to provide health insurance, and those we can't afford to. So it's a little bit of a strange experience for me compared to what I've done my whole career. And growing up, my family was born in Mexico. The other part of us were born here in the U.S. Mm-hmm. We usually got put into the same group as you're not worthy. So we didn't have health insurance growing up. You're not worthy of it. And as a single mom, I didn't have access to all the health insurance I needed. So I'm really trying to say the smartest thing that can be done out there is health for all, period.
Ronald Coleman, most of us here in Sacramento are familiar with Health Access and its partnership with lawmakers in crafting healthcare policy in California. But for those unfamiliar with this policy process here at the Capitol, explain the work that Health Access does.
You know, Health Access is a nonprofit-based organization that is a coalition. Essentially, we're a coalition of organizations that work to expand healthcare to all Californians. Our mission really is to ensure that we can deliver quality and affordable healthcare to all Californians. And all means all, as the senator said. You know, certainly there are about 3 million Californians who are uninsured. A little over 1.5 million of those are undocumented immigrants. So as we do work towards universal health care and work towards expanding Medi-Cal for the undocumented, but also working to make sure all Californians can afford health care, we must definitely make sure all of these parts are put into place and move forward this campaign, because people on the ground are desperate for health care coverage and suffering because of not being able to go to a doctor when they need one.
You opened this up, I think, in a perfect way about the notion that healthcare is a right. But you know, both of you know, not every Californian, much less those in the rest of the nation, agree with that. So why, for the sake of discussion here, and you've already touched on this, but let's elaborate, why is it a right?
Well, I think you mentioned about being fiscally wise. I think it's fiscally wise. I think it's a public health issue. I think it's a community issue of values. It's not an isolated immigration problem. We work with immigrants of all status. They go to school with our children. They go to church with us. We go to the same parks. We go to the same beaches. They are fully integrated in the sense of our contact and our communication. If they continue to be excluded, that affects us all. We're already paying for health coverage, but not in a smart way. We are legally obligated to provide emergency services. So if you don't have health insurance, you end up going to emergency room, but only where your symptoms will be treated, not the illness. And that's not smart. Emergency care costs 3 times more than preventative care. So it's not smart. It's not fiscally wise. What is it? A penny wise, pound foolish? Right. That's what it ends up being. And I think too many people look at this as an immigration problem, so therefore they think it's easily isolated.
Certainly, we know that once we can expand healthcare to more individuals, that's better for everybody. Certainly, premiums would go down when we have more people in the system. But we also know that there are real impacts to people. When they only have access to emergency Medi-Cal, certainly they don't have access to doctor visits. They don't have access to hospitalization services. They don't have access to prescription drugs. These are all things people need for survival. Health is wealth. We know that in order to contribute to society, to be a productive worker, to be a productive consumer in society, you certainly need to have your health care. And so to make sure that we have this investment in place, we know that we can certainly bring down the cost of healthcare for everybody. We can certainly make sure that we're paying attention to public health. We can certainly make sure that people who don't have access to healthcare today aren't paying out of pocket for exorbitant costs, which may put them into medical debt or even lead to bankruptcy. 1/3 of undocumented immigrants own their homes in the state of California. And so certainly we don't want to put people in a position to be homeless because of not having access to the basic right of healthcare.
More and more advocates of expanded health care coverage for immigrants are elected to legislatures, such as yourself, or placed in positions of influence. The debate goes from being just a policy discussion to becoming actual policy and law. And what better place to do it than here in California?
And California was, remember, 25 years ago, the first state in the country to pass the most hostile anti-immigrant ballot measure, which was Prop 187. So fast forward 25 years. We've gone past that for the most part, and now we're considered a leader on many fronts. Environmental issues, many social justice issues, economy, how well our economy does for most people. And so it's only right that we're also in the forefront of immigration issues. And this is not only if you're immigrant or second or first generation immigrant. This is to care about everybody, to make California truly the best state for everybody.
Mr. Coleman, I know in your career you've seen that arc that the senator refers to from what was a conservative state with some really conservative, closed-minded attitudes to where we are in 2019.
That's correct. And according to the California Immigrant Policy Center, about 40% of the state's population is foreign-born. Some of them may be naturalized citizens, but many of them still are in some type of immigrant status. Now, we know specifically for the undocumented population, about 2/3 of that population has been living here for more than a decade or longer. So certainly they've been contributing to California. As you mentioned, they pay $3 billion in state and local taxes, but often don't have access to a lot of the public programs that can assist people when they need those economic supports. Going back to 1994, when Prop 187 changed, even just 2 years later, in 1996, where federal welfare reform laws were changing at the federal level, certainly we were able to see that California made sure that even lawfully present immigrants who were in their first 5 years continue to remain in the Medi-Cal program and have access to health care. Even since that time, as the Obama administration rolled out the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, we made sure that the individuals who received deferred action had access to Medi-Cal. And certainly, even when we expanded the Affordable Care Act here in California, as it related to Medi-Cal to single childless adults up to 138% of the federal poverty level, we made sure that those 5-year barred folks were included as well. So California has a long-standing history of making sure that all lawfully present immigrants had certainly been included in the Medi-Cal program. And even since then, as we've seen, we've been able to build on that with SB 75 and making sure that we can expand to health for all kids, which has certainly expanded access to about 200,000 kids in California who would not have had health care without California making that investment to move it forward. And we're very pleased even this year to see Governor Newsom even move forward with SB 104, where health care under Medi-Cal would even be expanded to young adults between the ages of 19 and 25, which will certainly help about 90,000 people right away, and at full implementation up to about 140,000 individuals. So California really does need to continue moving the ball forward and making sure that we can expand to all undocumented adults to really get the benefits that the senator has laid out.
These benefits, this success, as you all well know, in any political issue, in any legislative issue, it comes incrementally. And you've seen that path come slowly, expanding the health care coverage for undocumented Californians. So fast forward here to 2019 and everything that's happened with the state budget. You're still using that incremental piecemeal approach to getting the whole state covered, one section of a community at a time. Let's talk about what happened with the budget and how this plan to expand Medi-Cal to the 19, 25-year-olds without regard to immigration status. How's that going to work?
We have, as a state, we have a commitment to cover all uninsured. We have to reach all uninsured. That is our stated goal. It is the governor's goal. It is the legislative goal. We have to get to covering all uninsured. There's no way to cover all the uninsured if 1.5 million undocumented are not included. So again, we cannot isolate, we should not isolate that group from whatever the budget is that's going to take. If we're going to talk about the budget and the funding of this, then let's look at it as a complete picture. How do we get to the 3 million uninsured? What's the plan and what's the budget it's going to take to get to the 3 million uninsured? Not undocumented or legally here. That should not be the calculation here. The calculation is, okay, how much is it going to cost? And let's fit it into a plan over the next few years to cover all uninsured.
You have advocated that expanded coverage for young people, regardless of immigration status, is extraordinary, but it's only half a loaf, so to speak. It leaves out a sizable portion of the population, the seniors in the communities. Elaborate more on how significant is that gap? Who are we leaving out?
Well, we're leaving out everybody above the age of 26, and that's the most significant number of the undocumented community. So what we set out to do was, yes, to increase the age from 18, which is what it had been, and also to include seniors. I mean, seniors who have been working need and deserve that coverage. And they find themselves without that coverage at a time when they're most vulnerable and need it the most. So we sort of jumped from 25 to let's include seniors as well. And in our next few years, how do we get the rest of our community covered?
And even during the debate with the budget, as Governor Newsom had proposed to expand Medi-Cal to ages 19 through 25, when we talk to those individuals, both Health Access and the California Immigrant Policy Center work with impacted individuals who are part of organizations that are part of our steering committee, a part of our campaign. What we've heard from them is that they're really worried about the elders in their families.
Right,
they're very concerned about their parents who are over the age of 65 or their grandparents.
That is, in fact, what I've heard, that a lot of the young people are even saying, hey, thanks for this coverage for me. This is great, but it's my grandparents who really need the help.
That's absolutely right. I mean, even as this bill has been presented, even in the first house, we heard numerous accounts from people, both in English and Spanish, where people talked about how desperate they were for care for their parents and grandparents. I mean, these are the people that raised them here in California, the people that have been working and contributing and really making California the economic, diverse powerhouse it is in our country. And for them, they really were hoping the focus focus was going to be on seniors. And we're hoping we can have a second bite of the apple.
Well, Senator, it sounds like the governor's heart is with you, but he has drawn a line in the sand budget-wise so far up to this point and said it's cost, pure and simple, especially if we're on the edge of a recession, as some fiscal prognosticators have said we are. And I know you've addressed this a little bit. The cost, is that just not really an issue that we need to be dealing with?
No, of course cost is always an issue for everything. And we have a lot of things that we need to cover in our budget. But again, how important is the issue and the cost of health care for everybody? We can't just isolate the cost of uninsured, undocumented, low-income community. We have to look at all Californians and not use immigration status as the determining factor in whether or not you're going to be covered by health insurance.
On a personal level, to the families in the communities in your district, what does this expanded coverage mean to them?
Well, you know, in my conversations with seniors themselves is their only hope of getting the kind of medical attention that they deserve, that they look for as human beings, is by passing this legislation and including it in the budget. It's life or death for them. And to be surrounded by families who can't do anything for them is very disturbing. It's very emotional. It would be like anybody, regardless if you're an immigrant or not. Mm-hmm. Imagine how frustrating, how horrible it feels for your grandmother, your grandfather, not to be able to get the medical attention they deserve after having been here for years and contributed so much. It's just wrong.
Do undocumented immigrants use the health care provided to them? And particularly with those in undocumented communities who nowadays are almost afraid to go out of their houses based on some of the draconian actions from our government. You now have medical care. You now have services. Well, I'm still afraid to use them.
Yeah, we often hear many cases of people being afraid to use services, but we also know that people do enroll in the programs. With driver's licenses, you know, folks were curious about whether people were going to be scared to share their information with the states. We know that over 1 million people got driver's licenses through the AB 60 program. We also know with the expansion to kids, SB 75, certainly parents enrolled children, and that helped over 200,000 children. And so certainly we do expect for the young adults program, as that rolls out, we do expect people to enroll there. However, there also is a chilling effect, as you say, to some of these programs. We don't even have to look any further than the public charge regulations that came out that would create a lot of fear and confusion on the ground as it relates to immigrants accessing care. We know that when the welfare laws changed in 1996, there was a downturn in enrollment for programs that even certain immigrant categories were eligible for. We still expect that today in this climate, given the confusion and fear around public charge, but also just the general attacks on immigrant communities, the immigration enforcement that we've seen have an uptick, and just even the words that we hear from the executive branch at the federal level, which are definitely causing immigrants to be fearful about accessing programs that they're absolutely eligible for today.
And using that same line of thinking, would more immigrants come to the U.S. if these policies were available? Would more of them come to California?
Immigrants don't come to the U.S. to be on Medi-Cal. That's not their goal. Their goal is to get away from horrendous, violent conflict where it's a life and death for them. That's why they leave. That's why anybody would leave their country. Why did Europeans leave their country to come to the U.S.? Why did the Jewish community leave their country to come to the U.S., where they had no knowledge of the language, the culture, where were they going to live, how were they going to live? They had to get away from a life and death. That's the only reason millions of people immigrate from a home country to another country, to a foreign country. That's what's at stake for them. They don't come for a driver's license. They don't come for Medi-Cal. Once they get here, they contribute, they work hard, they pay taxes just like everybody else. We never say, oh, by the way, you're undocumented, don't worry about paying taxes because you're not going to get the same services. We don't say that. We very conveniently take all of their hard work, we take all of their taxes, and then we draw the line over what they can or cannot get. That is wrong. It's unfair, and we should not live like that as a state.
You know, we really need to do all we can to make sure that we can give access to everybody in the country. We know that we can provide these services, preventive care, regular care, that people can use to avoid some of the really costly illnesses that we've seen. This is about people being able to access radiation and chemotherapy when they have cancer. It's about getting comprehensive treatment for your diabetes when you have it. It's about making sure that you can regulate your high blood pressure, deal with asthma in a comprehensive way. Many people who are living in our state right now don't have that option, even though they're paying into the system, and that's what we hope to change.
The federal government, the Trump administration, I know the answer to this, but just for the sake of discussion, how corrosive and punitive have the president's policies and words been?
The shooter in El Paso was very explicit about going forward to kill Mexicans. That is exactly the target that President Trump has identified as far as being the cause of all ills in this country, and rapist and undeserving as human beings of anything. So he has directly contributed to an environment that allows people who have biases and are racist already, but to take it to another level of violence, he's contributing to that without a doubt. And I think he should be ashamed of himself, of what he's doing to contribute to destroying our communities and what we work so hard for, to create the unity, to create the understanding, to create a sensitivity to different cultures and religions. He is doing just the opposite, and I'm ashamed for him.
I think the president's words have been very damaging. I think having an executive, having a person in the White House have words that are racist and classist and destructive as it relates to community relations and immigrant communities, communities of color in general, really has caused a lot of pain and hurt in communities across our state. And I think that, certainly we even know the policies that he's implemented, whether it's related to immigration enforcement or whether it's related to even changes related to the public charge rules, where he's trying to scare lawfully present immigrants from not accessing benefits. I mean, it's a coordinated attack on immigrants and on communities of color. And given California's demographics and given how diverse our population is, it really is important for California to continue to be a beacon for all communities, continue to be a beacon for immigrant communities, continue to make sure that we expand and provide access to care for individuals who continue to remain excluded and locked out of federal policies. It is not likely that we are going to see changes at the federal level as it relates to immigration policy and how that intersects with health care. California must continue to make sure that it stays on track and creating policies that can benefit its communities to make sure its economy stays strong.
And as proud as you are, I'm sure, of the success, as incremental as it might have been up to this point, in moving forward with health care for undocumented immigrants, it must also feel good to be able to see this as a pushback against the Trump administration as much as it is policy in California.
Yeah, although I'm not driven by Trump's hate, I'm driven by what's right and what we have been building for decades in California since Prop 187. That's what drives me. And he is just a terrible distraction that we all have to deal with. But my real focus, our real focus, is what's for the good of our community, for everybody, regardless of status, regardless of language, what's in the best interest of Californians. And this bill is one of the best things for California.
How confident are you in success on this as you move forward to the end of session as we speak, in terms of moving a lot of your colleagues along, some of whom still feel we should be providing coverage for those who come through the front door, not for the folks who come here a different way, especially in a system, the Medi-Cal system, that's already compromised. We already have a lot of vulnerable citizens out there, medically vulnerable, who aren't getting care. Why are we giving this carte blanche to undocumented immigrants?
Well, I think certainly there are some colleagues who hear that and are moved by that in a direction that would not support this. On the other hand, I think the overwhelming majority see all the right reasons. Regardless of where they stand on the immigration policy, they do see that immigration system is broken down. It's not working. It's not solving the issues. It's not addressing that. But on the other hand, they also see that we need to fix the healthcare system. And part of fixing the healthcare system is in our hands as legislators. And that means reaching out and making sure all uninsured are covered.
If we support the values, and if California wants to show a signal that it supports the values of getting to all and supports this population and wants to change the way it deals and manages how relations happen with the immigrant communities versus what we're seeing at the federal level, this is the right thing to move forward.
And by the way, we are not proposing a $3 billion expenditure here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been said publicly. This is about taking solid pieces of the uninsured and incorporating them over a reasonable period of time.
Back to my first question, which I'll make my last question to you. When we talk about the fight for healthcare for all, healthcare is a right. You not only have a legislative task or obligation, you also have an education obligation. How do you convince more Californians to have that shared belief, that shared value? And how long do you think it's going to be before this is a unanimous value that healthcare is a right?
Well, I think as a value, it's there and it's shared by most Californians. I think every time it's brought up, in my experience, every time it's brought up as an immigrant issue is where people get very thrown off and confused. And they get thrown off by some of the things that you said today. Well, they're going to come, more of them are going to come, blah, blah, blah. And they get it confused with immigration policy. And so every time it gets confused in that way, I think folks get thrown off. But for the most part, the value of healthcare for all, I think, is very much a California value.
Yeah, and as Senator Durazo put it earlier, I mean, certainly immigrants are neighbors. They go to church with us. They're all around us, and it makes sense to make sure that everybody can benefit having access to healthcare services. We know that it's a benefit to everybody. We know that we can reduce the cost of premiums for all people that have coverage today. And so we know that the migration hasn't had an uptick for years. According to the Migration Policy Institute, it's been at a net zero for a number of years. We would not expect for a number of people to enter the United States or come to California because of this type of expansion. But what we do know is that we need to make these changes to ensure that everybody can see a doctor when they need one. Everybody can access prescription drugs when they need one. They can get into a hospital if they have a serious healthcare condition and don't have to just depend on an emergency room or depend on where they live, depending on whether or not they have access to a county program. We really do want to make sure that everybody in California can continue to benefit from access to health care in the future. And the only way we can do that is by working with the administration to make these expansions. And we hope we're able to do that on our quest to get to all.
Thank you both for being on our podcast,
yes.
For your passion and your compassion and your advocacy. And I wish you luck here as we move forward with the legislative session. State Senator Maria Elena Durazo and Ronald Coleman, Director of Policy and Legislative Advocacy for Health Access California.
Thank you very much.
That wraps this edition of Then There's California. We are proud to have technical and production assistance and great ideas from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Aaron Kashishian, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Maria Elena Durazo of the 24th Senate District in Los Angeles County and Ronald Coleman, Director of Policy and Legislative Advocacy for Health Access California, I'm Brian Green from the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.